So I was having this conversation recently with a friend who is absolutely crushing it. And we were talking about outsourcing work. And I thought this would be a great practical video for those of you who are trying to make writing into a full-time gig. So let's talk about at what point you should outsource your work. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I like to make YouTube videos, and I hope you get some value out of this one. This was a concept that revolutionized my life. Before we get into it, though, I want to reinforce something. Writing is what writers do. It is the highest leverage activity that you can take as a writer. What do I mean by that? So there are a lot of things that are really important for a writer to do, especially in this current day and age. Publishing companies don't typically provide any sort of marketing for a book. They rely on the author to do that marketing. And if you go the self-published route, it's even more true, because when you go self-published, you are the publishing company. And even when you split the difference and you're going with a smaller press or an indie publisher, you end up needing to do a lot of the marketing yourself. The difference between a book that you market and a book you don't market in terms of performance is just astronomical. In fact, I've seen this happen. I've seen people write really, really good books, but nobody knows they exist. And so they sit on Amazon or they sit on the shelf and nobody buys them. So it's really important as a writer that you understand the marketing piece, that you start to get a handle on it, or that you have somebody who can do it for you. Unfortunately, it's expensive. And so when you're starting out as a writer, you often can't afford it. I know I couldn't. And so you end up doing all sorts of these other tasks. You'll write a bit, and then you'll go and see about getting a cover done, and then you have to talk to an editor, and then you've got social media stuff to do, which means writing posts, which means scheduling uploads, which means responding to comments, which means figuring all of this stuff out. And then if you really want to make a go of it, you've got to get ads, and you've got to figure out the copy for those ads, and you've got to figure out the creative for those ads. And then on top of that, when you get to launch day, you're going to want to schedule podcast appearances or blog appearances. You're going to want to get people to do reviews of your book. And it's honestly just really overwhelming. There's so much to do that you could spend all of your time doing that other stuff and not writing. But the catch-22 is that if you spend your time on that other stuff, you're not writing. And writing is your highest leverage activity. It is what makes you money. If you don't write the book, you can't sell the book. So you have to write the book. The question is, how do you balance these things? And at what point can you afford to say, maybe I'll get somebody to do the social media posting for me. Maybe I'll have somebody else do my newsletter so I can really focus on writing the books. That's a hard question to answer, and honestly, I can't answer it for you. It's going to be based on how much money you make and what kind of return you need to see for your specific context. But what I can do is I can give you a helpful principle that is going to guide you through this process. There's a really good book called Buyback Your Time. I'll put a link in the description below. If you have the chance, I would highly recommend reading it. It's more of a business book, but honestly, if you want to be a successful author, having an understanding of the business side is really good. So it's absolutely worth the time investment to read it, but I'm going to condense the principle here for you. So even if you don't read it, you'll have a basic sense of how to determine when you should start outsourcing this stuff. I like to follow a fairly simple formula for figuring all of this out. The first thing that you want to do is you want to identify your tasks. Because in order to know whether your task can be outsourced, you really have to understand what you're doing. This can actually be a really surprising step for a lot of people because we often don't actually understand what we do, and we don't often have a good sense of how much time it takes. For instance, when I was a new writer, I spent a lot of time polishing my first book, and then I was like, okay, I should be able in a couple hours a week to do all of the social media stuff around it, and that'll give me plenty of time to write my next book. And then I tried, and I realized after about 3 weeks that I had not made any progress on my second book. And that's because it was actually taking me all of the time that I had set aside for writing and for pursuing being an author. It was taking up all of my time. Posting to social media, coming up with all of the content, coming up with the creative, getting all of the posts together, getting them out there, engaging with people, all of that was just taking a huge amount of time, and I didn't have any time to write. So it was helpful to me to clearly identify every single little tiny minute task that I was doing. Once I did that, I realized that there was a lot of dead space in what I was doing, and I could tighten it up without having to outsource anything. But let's just use my example. Once I got my process sort of in place for how I was going to engage on social media, I realized that it was taking me about 4 hours to do my newsletter content, to get it all set up, and another 2 hours to cross-post all of that content to social media throughout the week. So that is 6 hours a week that I was spending not writing. And your situation is probably going to be different. You might not be on social media as much, you might be on social media more. But by writing this list and determining how much time we are spending, not how much time it should take optimally, but how much time are you actually spending on each of these tasks? And for me, it turned out to be about 6 hours a week. Then the next step is to determine how much your time is actually worth. And that's a fairly simple thing. You just take the total profit that you've made and divide it by the time that you've spent making that money. And that tells you how much you make an hour. This is the same way that you'd figure out how much you're getting paid per hour for your job. You just take the total amount of money you make and you divide it by the total number of hours you work. Hey presto, your hourly rate. Now, I like to use profit instead of revenue. So profit is how much you make after everything you pay for. Thankfully, as an author, I don't have a ton of overhead. And so even if I use revenue instead of profit, it's still going to come out pretty accurate. So this means I need to know two things. I need to know how much money I made, and I need to know how much time I'm spending doing the work. At that point in my career, I was spending about 2 hours a day. So 2 hours a day is 14 hours a week. 14 hours a week is 728 hours in a year. So I was spending about 728 hours working on being an author. So that's how much time I was spending, but how much money was I actually making? So I was averaging about $2,000 a month. And $2,000 a month is $24,000 over the course of a year. And so to figure out how much am I making per hour that I'm working on this? So $24,000 a year divided by the 728 hours that I was working, I end up with about $33, which is pretty freaking good. I was making $33 an hour writing books. That's fantastic. Until I remembered that I was actually making $33 an hour to post to Facebook and social media and to write some newsletter content. And that didn't feel as good. I mean, that would have felt great if somebody else was paying me, but that was my money. I was paying $33 an hour for that service. Now, I was paying myself because I was spending 6 hours of my time every week doing that work. And then I got to thinking, what if I could be writing during that time? Because writing is the thing that actually makes me money. The rest of the stuff is good and it's important, but it's not as important as writing. Even at 500 words an hour, which is honestly pretty low, if I had 6 hours a week of extra writing time, that's 156,000 words over the course of a year. That's an entire novel worth of work. So by not doing the posting, by not doing the social media stuff, by not writing the newsletter content, I could potentially write an entire novel, which meant that if I could find somebody to do the work of creating the newsletter content, of posting to social media for less than $33 an hour, I would be making money. As long, of course, as I used that time that I got back in order to do the more productive thing of writing a book. So I took that number I had and I started looking around for people to help. Now, ideally, you want to settle at about 25%. And 25% of $33 is only $8.25. And it would be awesome if I could find somebody who would be willing to do the work of posting to social media, of coming up with newsletter content for $8.25. Honestly, that's not really realistic. Most people who are doing services like that are going to charge a little bit more. But it might also not take them 6 hours a week. In fact, it shouldn't take them 6 hours a week because they're professionals. They're better at it. Just like I'm better at writing a novel than they are, they're better at creating content and posting to social media than I am. And so instead of me spending 6 hours a week doing this, I might be able to pay somebody for 2 hours a week to do this and get the same amount of work. But this also gives you a really clear idea of whether or not you can afford to have somebody else do the work, whether you can afford to do the outsourcing. Again, if you take the total amount you make, now I like to use profit instead of revenue, but if you take the total amount you make, you divide it by the number of hours that you spend on every task related to that work, that's going to give you your hourly rate. And then if you divide that by 4 or take a quarter of it, that's going to give you how much money you should really be spending on these activities that are not your core moneymaker. And as a writer, you should be writing. Your core moneymaker is writing novels. Even if you're not there yet, even if you run the numbers and you're like, oh man, nobody is going to accept $2.50 to do this job, that's okay. You want to start framing your thinking so that when you get to that point, you can identify it. You know realistically how much you can afford to spend outsourcing services and when you should outsource the services. I know this was a very sort of business-oriented video, but I do want to stress, being an author is part art, part business. And so understanding the business of this is going to allow you to accelerate your career as an author incredibly.